Welcome to Speed Reads: The Wages of Destruction, an Economic History of Nazi Germany. How did Nazi Germany, a seemingly unstoppable force during World War II, come to face ultimate defeat? Traditional narratives emphasize the personal qualities of leaders like Winston Churchill or the irrational inability of Hitler's regime to harness Germany's industrial might. But Adam Tooze argues that these perspectives, which focus primarily on political and military strategies, overlook deeper, more fundamental factors. Before we begin, please take a moment to subscribe. Your support is greatly appreciated. As Tooze sees it, purely political explanations ignore the economic underpinnings that defined the capabilities and limits of the Third Reich. The sheer scale of the conflict, set against the economic dimensions of Germany's adversaries, made Nazi aspirations unsustainable. In this summary, we'll argue that Germany's defeat wasn't a question of strategic missteps, it was rooted in the structural inadequacies of the country's economic base. Diving into these inadequacies not only reshapes our understanding of one of the most pivotal periods in modern history, but also offers a fascinating exploration of the intersection between economics and warfare. For anyone interested in the real forces that shape historical outcomes, this summary presents an essential and thought-provoking narrative that questions what we think we know about World War II. Ideology underpinned Nazi Germany's war effort. The story of the Second World War has been told many times, and each generation of historians has tended to emphasize different factors in the conflict. Between roughly 1945 and the mid-1970s, for example, narratives in the West tended to focus on the Western Front. These accounts emphasized pivotal battles fought by American and British forces: the Battle of Britain, the North African campaigns, the invasion of Italy, and D-Day. Hitler, in short, had been defeated in the West. Of course, historians didn't forget about the Eastern Front. Germany had faced severe setbacks at Moscow, Leningrad, and Stalingrad. But Eastern Europe was usually regarded as a secondary theater in the war. These accounts were challenged in the 70s as a new generation of historians began to pay more attention to the Eastern Front. They pointed out that over 80% of all losses suffered by the German army had been inflicted in Eastern Europe, primarily by the Soviet Union. A second factor also contributed to this narrative shift. Growing awareness and historical examination of the Holocaust in the 1980s and 1990s underscored the importance of the Eastern Front. It was here, after all, that the true evil of the Nazi regime was most evident. These interventions were an important correction to the historical record, but they also suffered shortcomings of their own. Historians now suggested that Nazi Germany had essentially fought two different kinds of war simultaneously. On the Western Front, it had waged a rational war shaped by pragmatic concerns about strategy and the balance of power. On the Eastern Front, by contrast, it had waged an ideological war to eliminate Europe's Jewish population and create Lebensraum, living space for future German colonists. But this view overlooks the complex nature of Nazi ambitions and strategies. It suggests that ideology was exclusively influential on the Eastern Front, while pragmatism ruled in the West. In reality, Nazi Germany's military and political strategies were deeply intertwined across all fronts. Although the nature of war differed in Western and Eastern Europe, Germany's ambitions on both fronts were shaped by the same ideological goals. Put simply, Hitler believed that Germany could only challenge its Western rivals, above all the United States and the British Empire, if it controlled as much territory and as many resources as those powers. The racial purification of Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, in other words, was a means to the rational goal of outcompeting the Western powers. Nazi Germany's goals made a two-front war inevitable in the early 20th century. The United States had already established itself as an economic colossus, far surpassing the economic outputs of European powers. By the 1920s, for instance, national income per capita in the U.S. was 3 times higher than that of the British Empire and nearly 4 times that of Germany. These disparities did not escape the notice of European leaders, particularly Adolf Hitler, who viewed America's economic prowess as a benchmark. Hitler was particularly influenced by America's history of Western expansion, believing that the U.S. had secured its industrial dominance and high living standards through the conquest, displacement, and extermination of Native American populations. Similarly, in Hitler's eyes, the economic power of the British Empire was down to its vast empire and its many colonies. Germany, by contrast, had never been a great colonial power, and its own territory lacked the resources required to go toe-to-toe with powers like the U.S. and Britain. As Hitler saw it, the only way Germany could avoid being reduced to the status of a minor power under American global hegemony was to expand eastwards. The conquest, displacement, and extermination of Eastern Europe's Jewish and Slavic populations would create an economic base large enough for Germany to establish itself as a hegemonic power in its own right. When Hitler came to power in 1933, he immediately began preparing Germany for this expansionary war. He quickly dismantled the restrictions imposed by the Treaty of Versailles, which had limited Germany's military capabilities post-World War I. The rearmament program initiated by Hitler was not just a means to restore national pride, but a deliberate strategy to revive the German economy through military buildup. Even the construction of freeways, while touted as job creation measures, was primarily aimed at enhancing military logistics. Hitler believed that the war in the East would be a quick one. Nazi ideology, after all, rested on the assumption of German racial superiority over Eastern European Slavs and Jews. But Hitler also expected the Western powers to push back against German expansion. In order to conquer Eastern Europe, Germany would have to deal a decisive military blow to Britain and France before the United States had time to intervene on their side. Lacking extensive resources of its own, Hitler believed that Germany had no choice but to capture strategic areas in Eastern Europe like the oil fields of the Caucasus and the fertile lands of Ukraine in order to fight the Western powers. From the very beginning of Hitler's rule, then, German planning foresaw a two-pronged military campaign in both the West and East. Germany didn't have the resources for protracted conflicts. Nazi Germany's focus on rearmament vastly outweighed all concern for civilian welfare. In terms of economic planning, a choice had to be made, to put it simply, between guns and butter. In this trade-off, guns invariably prevailed. By the mid-1930s, butter, like many other food staples, was already being rationed. That was hardly surprising. Millions of workers were being redirected from farms to armament factories in urban centers. The upshot was that German agriculture declined and Germany became even less self-sufficient in food. For the Nazi regime, that made the conquest of Eastern Europe even more compelling. This was just one of the many ways in which the logic of rearmament made war all but inevitable. Self-reliance in food was a totemic issue in Nazi thinking and planning. Hitler was acutely aware of the severe impact that malnutrition and related diseases had had on the German civilian population during World War I, largely due to the Allied blockade, which contributed to around 600,000 deaths. As Hitler saw it, demoralizing shortages on the home front had been a crucial factor in Germany's defeat. He believed that the only way for Germany to win a war from its position of relative weakness was to win it quickly. The longer a conflict dragged on, the more Germany's resources would be strained. The sooner its forces prevailed, on the other hand, the more resources it would control. Speed, then, played a vital role in Nazi Germany's military planning. That said, it's a mistake to connect this planning with the so-called Blitzkrieg or lightning war strategy. The Blitzkrieg strategy, characterized by rapid, decisive assaults by armored divisions supported by intense aerial bombardment, was originally an act of improvisation rather than a meticulously planned strategy to ease the burdens of war on the German populace. The initial plans for invading France, for example, involved a direct confrontation that could have prolonged the conflict. But a fortuitous interception of these plans by the Allies forced Germany to adopt the riskier but ultimately successful maneuver through the Ardennes, leading to a quick defeat of Allied forces in Western Europe in 1940. In the end, German forces got bogged down in Eastern Europe, the front on which they had expected the swiftest victories. In late 1941, after months of rapid advances, the German army was halted outside Moscow. German assumptions about their own supposed racial superiority and Soviet weakness proved faulty. Despite catastrophic losses, the Soviet Union rallied its forces and dug in. The Red Army's stubborn resistance plunged Germany into exactly the kind of protracted conflict that it had feared, and which it was always unlikely to win. Nazi-conquered territories didn't provide enough resources from an economic standpoint. Germany faced daunting challenges in World War II, contending not only with Britain and the Soviet Union, but also with the vast resources of the United States and the British Empire. To tackle this, Germany shifted its naval strategy toward intensifying its U-boat campaign, aiming to sever British supply lines across the Atlantic. But the German fleet was too small to effect significant disruption, especially against an enemy armed with the ultra-decoder, which allowed the Allies to preempt German maneuvers. Economic strain also undermined Germany's ability to launch an invasion of Britain in 1940. Germany's Air Force, the Luftwaffe, suffered considerable losses in the spring campaign, and there was a dire shortage of trained pilots and effective aircraft. This made their ambitions to dominate the skies over the English Channel unattainable. Compounding these difficulties was the failure to secure the oil-rich Middle East, a key strategic objective that floundered following Britain's quelling of a German-supported uprising in Iraq. Of course, Germany did conquer several European territories and exploit their resources. But this was not a sustainable solution. The extensive plunder of France illustrates this point. While initially providing a significant stockpile of military equipment and materials, the plundering severely disrupted the French economy and was quickly depleted. This situation hastened Hitler's decision to invade the Soviet Union, seeking new resources to continue the war effort. As we've seen, the invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941 initially brought swift victories. But these were quickly overshadowed by logistical nightmares. As German forces advanced, they faced acute shortages of fuel and ammunition. Fuel shortages also meant that the agricultural output of occupied territories like Ukraine could not be effectively harvested or utilized, complicating the feeding of both troops and the German civilian population. Germany's dire resource situation led to horrific strategies for dealing with the native populations in Eastern Europe. The German military and the Nazi regime resorted to planned starvation and systemic neglect. Millions of prisoners of war and civilians perished under these policies, with the siege of Leningrad and other occupied territories marked by deliberate blockades and the withholding of food. But even these brutal tactics couldn't compensate for the fact that Nazi Germany's dependence on rapid conquests ultimately proved unsustainable. Roosevelt, anti-Semitism and strategic contradictions. By 1941, Nazi anti-Semitism intensified as Hitler became obsessed with Franklin D. Roosevelt, whom he saw as a key supporter of his enemies who was funneling American resources to Britain and the Soviet Union. This obsession coincided with the escalating American involvement following Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor, prompting Hitler to declare war on the United States in December 1941. Hitler was driven by a conviction of a Jewish conspiracy linking Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt, which fueled his commitment to the extermination of European Jews. This genocidal campaign presented a contradiction within the Nazi regime, particularly concerning labor resources. At a time when Germany faced severe manpower shortages due to the ongoing war, the decision to exterminate millions of able-bodied Jews was seen as counterintuitive. The concept of annihilation through labor emerged as a compromise, attempting to reconcile the extreme views of the SS, who advocated for immediate extermination, with military leaders who saw value in utilizing Jews deemed fit for labor. At the Wannsee Conference in early 1942, aimed at coordinating this final solution, the discussion did not openly address methods of extermination like gassing or shooting. Instead, the proposal suggested deporting Jews eastward for forced labor on construction projects. Despite this, records from the conference clearly marked approximately 2.5 million Jews in occupied Poland as unfit for work, and the implicit consensus was their elimination. The Wannsee Conference revealed that only about 40% of Jews were considered useful for labor-intensive construction, yet even these individuals were subjected to horrific conditions. Starvation, beatings, and unsanitary living quarters underscored their expendable status, a harsh reality also extended to foreign workers brought into the German economy. As the war progressed into 1943 and 1944, Germany's armament production saw an increase, largely due to the exploitation of forced labor from concentration camps. The conditions within these armaments factories were awful, with extremely high mortality rates exacerbated by severe punishments for minor infractions. In pursuit of increased output, the quality of military hardware suffered. The tanks and aircraft produced were inferior to those manufactured by the Allies, compromising the effectiveness of the German military machine. Ideological rigidity hastened Nazi Germany's collapse. As the war progressed into its later stages, Nazi Germany was in a race against time, investing heavily in the development of sophisticated weaponry like jet fighters, submarines, and even the atomic bomb. But Germany simply didn't have the time it needed to refine these Wunderwaffen or wonder weapons. Most of these innovations were hurriedly developed and failed to significantly impact the course of the war. Take the V-2 rocket, the first ever long-range guided ballistic missile. Even this innovative weapon, which bombarded London, lacked the warhead capacity to have a decisive impact. What Germany really needed wasn't new offensive weapons, but adequate defenses against the dual threat of British-American air raids and the relentless advance of the Red Army in the east. Allied bombing wreaked havoc on German military and industrial capacities, particularly in the heavy industrial zones, eroding civilian morale and confidence in Hitler's leadership. This led to increased domestic repression as Hitler attempted to maintain control during the final, desperate months of the conflict. Conditions within Germany deteriorated sharply as inflation skyrocketed, the black market boomed, and living standards fell dramatically. The Nazi regime resisted raising taxes on private incomes, choosing instead to burden businesses with the costs of war. But this strategy failed to shield civilians from the war's harsh realities. Unlike their counterparts in Britain, the US, and the Soviet Union, the Nazis did not mobilize women into the workforce in significant numbers. Nazi ideology precluded this option, with Hitler preferring to keep women out of the workforce by providing substantial allowances to soldiers' wives to prevent them from seeking employment. The Nazi regime's ideological rigidity permeated its approach to war. By 1942, many of Germany's realistic economic managers and military generals had concluded that the war was unwinnable. Yet figures like Albert Speer, the Minister of Armaments and War Production, highlighted the fanaticism that drove the Nazi leadership. Speer clung to his belief in the triumph of the will, claiming that Germany could achieve victory through sheer determination. Despite the relentless optimism of Nazi ideologues, by the end of 1942, after significant military setbacks against the Soviet Union, the likelihood of Germany achieving its ambitious war aims dwindled drastically. Nazi Germany's ideological zeal was disconnected from the strategic realities on the ground, and from this point it would only continue a futile and destructive conflict driven more by fanaticism than feasible military or economic strategy. Final summary. In this summary to The Wages of Destruction by Adam Tooze, you've learned that Nazi Germany waged very different wars on the Western and Eastern fronts. Despite these differences, though, it pursued a single ideological strategy, aiming to use the resources of Eastern Europe to bolster its struggle against Western powers like the United States. Hitler's vision, inspired by American expansionism, drove his ambitions for territorial expansion and led to brutal economic and military strategies. This included reliance on forced labor and rapid rearmament, sacrificing civilian welfare and economic stability. Strategic misjudgments like the underestimation of Soviet resilience further strained Germany's resources, culminating in a catastrophic defeat driven by ideological extremism and strategic overreach. Okay, that's it for this speed read summary. We hope you enjoyed it. If you can, please take the time to subscribe. We always appreciate your feedback. See you in the next one.